Integrate, the podcast where we discuss the joys and frustrations of trying to live an integrated Christian life. Your hosts are Dr. Bob Robinson and me, Brendan Romai. Today we have another nationally known guest, Dr. John Fia. Dr. Fia is a distinguished professor of American history at Messiah University in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, where he has taught since 2002. He received his PhD in American history from Stony Brook University, and before that, a master's in church history and a master of divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Bob, I'm pretty sure that means he has one-upped you on degrees from Trinity.
Yeah, to know John is to know that he loves to be competitive, and I saw that on the basketball court our time at Trinity. So yes, he always has to do one better than anyone else. Thanks for that, John.
You know what it was? At Trinity, like, I don't know if they could still do this, but I realized like about a year into my MDiv that like I didn't think I wanted to be a pastor. So like, well, all you guys were taking courses in like, I don't know, like how to do a funeral or how to, pastoral counsel and all that. I was taking church history courses for all my MDiv electives. And then one day, John Woodbridge, my kind of mentor at Trinity, said to me like, you almost have enough for a master's in church history. And
right.
So you could overlap a lot. And I think that's why I was able to do it.
I'll tell the folks out there who you are. John Fia is a sought-after writer and speaker on a variety of historical subjects, including history of America, how evangelical Christians view history of America, the history of how evangelicals came to embrace and vote for President Donald Trump. He has written several publications. It's a list that's way too long to say. I've seen your articles in The Atlantic and Christianity Today and Washington Post and Fox News and USA Today and Vox with a V and Religion News Service, several other publications. John has a very popular daily blog called The Way of Improvement Leads Home, and his podcast is the same name, so check out his podcast. His books include the book he named his blog after, that's The Way of Improvement Leads Home, Philip Vickers' Fithian and the Rural Enlightenment in Early America. Another book he wrote, and we'll talk about some today, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? He has also written a book titled Why Study History? Reflecting on the Importance of the Past. Brendan and myself, we have a friend, a student at Kent State Stark. He's a history major, and I told him he had to read that. So he read it, and he gave it a thumbs up review. So he really enjoyed that.
That's
so
good.
Donovan Byler.
It was written for undergrads. So, I targeted it for that exact audience.
John has appeared on NBC News, CNN, C-SPAN, MSNBC, NPR, dozens of radio programs across the country. But now, the pinnacle of his appearances has finally happened. Welcome to the Reintegrate podcast, John.
So true. That is so true, Bob.
It is, right?
Especially since we go so far back, right? We were talking before we came on about our we shared a floor at Trinity. And those were some good times.
We had Vincent Baycoat on a few weeks ago.
The esteemed theologian, Wheaton College theologian.
That's right. You can't get much better than that, right?
That's right. Yeah.
He wins.
That's right. I play second fiddle to Vince. I always have.
So I don't even want to grow up to be an esteemed theologian. Just like a tolerated theologian would be good.
It's good. It's good.
Moving on to our first proper question. Your book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, is 273 pages long. That is a lot of pages to say no. So I'm guessing that the answer to the question in your title is a little more complex than a simple yes or no. That being said, and I haven't read it, but I am aware that there's also a book called The Myth of a Christian Nation. They're also saying no in the title as well.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I probably should have read the book before I referenced it, but it's a lot of work to make one reference. But so I guess clearly that's a topic people are thinking about, though, and that's a question they're asking. So can you explain the nuances of your answer to that question?
It's interesting that you mentioned Greg Boyd's book, The Myth of a Christian Nation. My book is very different than his, although we cover some of the same ground. You know, people who are engaging with this question of was America founded as a Christian nation or is it a Christian nation? Most people kind of come at it with a clear, you know, they start their project with, or their book with, you know, I'm going to prove it is, or I'm going to prove it isn't. You know, in other words, like they come in with a set agenda. It's usually some kind of a political agenda, either harsh, you know, hard political agenda or sort of a loose, you know, soft political agenda. And I think that's what Greg Boyd's book is. I mean, and I agree with Greg Boyd's book. You know, he's trying to Greg Boyd is a pastor, somewhat of a, you know, an activist, you know, who wants to show that it is idolatry, right, to place the nation over the kingdom of God, right? It's a form of idolatry. And he's very strong about that. Anytime we place the flag or the country or the Star-Spangled Banner or anything over God, we're in danger. And he tries to point out how Christians have done this through the years. Just to illustrate, it's interesting that you brought those two books up, because when I was writing my book, I asked Greg Boyd if he would write a blurb for my book. And he asked me to explain the book or send him a proposal, and I did, and he would not do it. And the reason he said no, I think, is the best way to describe how my book is different. I tried to approach this question. This was 2009, 10 when I started writing this book. I tried to approach this question as a historian, right? Which means it is complex. You know, if you're to, you know, I wanted to say, what did the founding fathers believe about the relationship between church and state, or religion and government, about the relationship between Christianity and the American founding? And I mean, you can never be completely unbiased. You always come into these projects with some kind of an agenda. But as a historian, I wanted to just lay out kind of, you know, the facts. And I think there are parts of my book that people on the Christian right, or people who do believe America is a Christian nation today, could probably pull some things out of that book to make their case. You know, and
how about that?
There's also a lot of stuff in that book that people who don't think America was a Christian nation could make their case. All right, it's a very kind of neutral kind of book. So it's interesting. When that book came out, I would go on like radio programs and stuff, and for some reason, the publicist would always put me on a program like Christian right or right-wing radio, like, you know, the local like 6:00 p.m. drive time guy on the conservative station in Atlanta or whatever. And I would get on with him, and, you know, he'd do the setup, and he'd say, you know, America is founded as a Christian nation. We got John, you know, Fia here, you know, so yes or no, you know? And then I would say, you know, well, it's you know, it's kind of complicated, you know, it depends, blah, blah, blah. And then it was like, there was nothing else. It was clear there was nothing else to talk about then. It was just like, what?
No.
like what you're supposed to say. Of course it was, you know, you're on W whatever, XYZ in Atlanta. We're the voice of conservatism, right? And like, nuance and complexity is not something that fits very well in our current culture wars, right? It is complex, and it depends how you define the word Christian. It depends how you define when the nation began. You know, we could get into some of the weeds a little bit, but, you know, the United States was founded in a deeply Protestant culture, and that Protestant culture influenced a lot of the founding fathers and influenced a lot of the founding documents. On the other hand, the United States was also the elite men who founded the United States were also very, very steeped in what we would call the Enlightenment, right? You know, rational ideas emanating from Europe that criticized Christianity and tried to separate Christianity from government. So, you know, it's really hard to give a definitive yes or no on that question, at least as it played out in 1776 or 1789, right? Now, you want to talk about, is America a Christian nation today? There have been things that have happened since 1776. There have been additions made to the United States Constitution. There have been new Supreme Court acts that have been passed, which makes the idea of America being a Christian nation today, I would say, impossible to argue, at least in an official way. And we could, again, we could talk about the culture, right? Christianity.
To argue for or against?
Today, I would say there's no way, like constitutionally or based upon the ways in which the founding documents have been interpreted, that you could make a case that America is a Christian nation, as many on the Christian right want to say that or argue that.
Wasn't it like in 1954 or something that "In God We Trust" was put on our coins?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the story, right? I mean, under God, in the Pledge of Allegiance, "In God We Trust" put on bills. Now, Abraham Lincoln put "In God We Trust" on coins in the 1860s. But on bills, that didn't come about till Eisenhower. That was like the 1950s. Right. So there's this common misperception, I think, among many Christians that somehow like these things go back to the founding. I would say if you had to, if you were to go back to the 18th century, the easier case to make about was America founded as a Christian nation, the easier case to make with the most evidence is that the founding fathers wanted to create a nation defined by religious liberty in which church and state were separated. But you are going to find people who rejected that idea in the 18th century. People like Patrick Henry and John Witherspoon, the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence, Samuel Adams, even John Adams to an extent, although he wasn't a Christian, at least by sort of historic measures. He was a Unitarian, right? So he rejected the Trinity. So that's why I say it's a little messy when you're talking about it in the 18th century. And in some ways, those today who debate the idea, was America founded as a Christian nation or not? It's really a question that did not emerge in public discourse in any significant way until people like Jerry Falwell Sr. and the moral majority in the late 1970s and 1980s began to feel threatened that their Christian nation was falling apart, and they began to turn back to the founding and make this argument. The idea of is America a Christian nation was not a dominant thing that the founders were talking about. It's like taking a 21st century or 20th century idea and superimposing it on the 18th century when they weren't asking that question, at least predominantly.
There were a lot of deists. That's what I was taught in high school. Like a lot of the founders were deists, right?
Again, this gets back to Brendan's point about nuance. I would say very few of the men who signed the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the state constitutions that were established in 1776 after they threw off the British royal governments. I would say very few of those men could be defined as deists in the purest sense of 18th century English deism. When we think about deism, we think about a person who maybe your listeners or viewers have heard about the sort of watchmaker god of Thomas Paley, right? This is a god who creates the world, sets it in motion through scientific laws, natural laws, and then pulls back and never again intervenes, right? Doesn't perform miracles, doesn't answer prayer, isn't providential over the affairs of men and so forth. Now, some deists in the 18th century did believe that there might be a judgment afterwards based on whether you were a good or bad person. But there was no pure deists in the sense that even the most anti-Christian founding fathers, people like Jefferson and Ben Franklin, always made these appeals to providence.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, right?
Yeah, so there's this moment like in the Constitutional Convention when you probably remember this from your civics class, right? There was this debate between like the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan, and then there was the Connecticut Compromise about whether there should be 2 senators per state, and it looked like the Constitutional Convention was going to collapse. It was going to break up. They weren't going to get anywhere. They weren't going to have a constitution. And like Ben Franklin, probably one of the most skeptical of the founding fathers when it comes to faith, kind of stands up and says, we need to pray. Like, we need God to come in and intervene right now.
Right.
To help us, our country survive.
I mean, I've heard that story, and it's like always wondered, is this apocryphal?
No, it's true.
Because
it's true. He calls for prayer. Now, again, a deist doesn't call for prayer. A pure deist, right? Now, the way the story went is also, interesting, because Franklin's plea for prayer is actually rejected. And it's rejected. It's rejected. This is the complication of it, right? It's rejected not because like they hate prayer, right? It's rejected because in the 18th century you can't it's not like evangelicals, right? Hey, okay, somebody lead us. Like Ben, why don't you lead us? Or whatever. You have to have a minister come in, and you have to pay the minister. And they were working on like a really shoestring budget, and they couldn't afford to pay the minister. And so that's why they didn't have the prayer.
Oh my goodness.
And there's this great there's also an apocryphal story about that with Alexander Hamilton, a noted kind of skeptic, who, when Franklin said, "Let's pray," he said, "I reject Ben Franklin's proposal because the United States of America should never subordinate itself to any outside or foreign powers," right? Like, namely God. Now that is apocryphal, but it made its way, like the cherry tree story, like George Washington, into like some 19th century school books, right?
And it's in the musical now, right?
No, actually, that's not it. I don't think that's it.
It's not in the musical of him singing that or rapping that?
It's not in the musical, okay. Bob. I can confirm. My girlfriend made me watch it.
Yeah, I taught a whole class on the musical last fall on Hamilton. So I
bet you had pretty good attendance for that.
It was fun. It was a fun class. So yeah, that's a complicated question. I mean, there was a historian, his name is Greg Fraser, who wrote a really good book in which he argued that the founders, and I tend to agree with him, the founders were what he called theistic rationalists. In other words, they believed in God. They believed God could act in the world and was providential and may have even been kind of active in, the world, maybe even answered prayer. But, this God did not reveal himself in the form of a man, did not, raise that, Jesus wasn't God. There was no Trinity. There was no, so it's really hard to sort of say that they were Christians. Matter of fact, it's impossible to say a lot of them were Christians. Now, there were some Christians too, right? There, I would say people like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, they were clearly much more Christian and even somewhat evangelical in their beliefs.
John Jay.
Yeah, John Jay, of course, John Witherspoon.
So there are a lot of evangelical Christians who have been taught that America is indeed founded specifically to be a Christian nation.
Yeah.
And I read The Light and the Glory from Pierre Marshall and David Manuel when I first became a Christian. I was like, this is fascinating. This is amazing.
Yeah.
I know a lot of Christians my age have read and even taught it to their children, right? It's kind of like, this is homeschool 101. This is your history lesson. And more recently, David Barton has been leading the group called Wall Builders to prove that America's lost its Christian founding. On Christian TV and radio, I used to hear James Kennedy and now Robert Jeffress and Eric Metaxas. They're espousing this belief. So what do you think is the reason why they so desire to have people believe that America was founded as a Christian nation?
Yeah. Everybody is looking for some type of what historians call a usable past, right? Most people go to, the only reason they go to the past or want to know anything about the past is so that they can find something in the past to advance whatever their agenda happens to be in the present, right? Call it cherry picking, whatever you want to call it. Some call it law school history, in a bad way. You know, I think about a lawyer, right? You know, say you're a defense lawyer and you're trying to get your client off on a murder charge or some kind of technicality or something. You know, you're not gonna go into like case law and just be like, oh, let's just look at case law in all its fullness and complexity, right? No, you're gonna go looking specifically for a case that you can pull out and use and apply it to your current situation. And that's not how historians work. You know, the job of the historian is to understand things in context, the complexity of the human experience, right? How things have changed over time. So we all look for a usable past. We all try to find a past that's useful for the present. But for people, the people you just named, they're not interested in history. They're not interested in confronting history in all its complexity, right? They're not interested in what the great theologian of hope, Jürgen Moltmann, once described as going into the past and resurrecting the dead and putting the pieces back together that are broken, right? They're not interested in the brokenness. They're not interesting enough. They all have very high views of human sin, right? But they're right. They're unwilling to kind of engage the past for its good and bad, right? I mean, anyone who has a robust view of human sin, like, is going to expect like America to have like a lot of serious dark moments. You know, we're not this innocent nation. No nation is that way. So I think what they're doing is they're responding to cultural trends. And, you know, we can make a long list of those cultural trends. We can begin in, you know, the 60s with prayer and Bible reading being taken out of public schools, right? We could talk about the Immigrant Act of 1965. It was known as the Hart-Celler Act, which brought in massive numbers of Asian, Middle Eastern, non-Western, basically, immigrants, who were not, many of them not Christian. So Islam is now coming into the country and all these other non-Western religions. The civil rights movement, I think, shakes things up a little bit because now no longer can, especially in the South, these Christian academies and colleges, Bob Jones being the best example, no longer can they segregate and not allow black students to come into their schools, or else they lose their tax-exempt status. So there's this fear that like big government is coming in, right? And they're disrupting our way of life.
Right.
They're telling us, they're telling us we need to desegregate. You know, then you add Roe v. Wade, and it's a perfect storm. And usually when throughout history, whenever there are profound cultural changes happening, demographic, cultural changes in, belief systems, people get nostalgic for an era when, if we could just go back to when everything was nice and peaceful or calm, and usually nostalgia is a very selfish way of dealing with the past because you want to go back to a way when you felt good. Right. So let's make America great again. Right. Let's go back to like the 50s, white middle class people like we all are. Right. Let's go back to the 50s. And that's when I liked it. We were a Christian nation. Right. Well, you ask any person of color or a woman or, what was the 50s right. like for you? I don't want to go back. So it was right around that time, the time of the bicentennial, 1976, when the political organization known as the Moral Majority, which then sort of spawned into a bunch of different organizations, the Christian Coalition, all under this kind of umbrella of the Christian right or the religious right, began looking for that usable past. Let's find, if we can prove that America was founded as a Christian nation, then that will give us... will fortify our argument that we need to now develop a politics that will reclaim and renew or restore.
We get kind of confused as lay people. We're not. Some of us. I mean, Brendan has a minor in history, and they got some training in this. But if I'm listening to David Barton, and he's able to quote this founding father saying this, and he's able to say, look what this happened, and he's able to say, I've actually got the original documents here, and we're just going to look at that and say, John Fia is so full of it. Look at it. Yeah. Barton's got all this stuff.
Yeah, and David Barton essentially has said on multiple occasions that I'm full of it. A lot of this has nothing to do with history. It has to do with politics and political platforms. You know, Barton comes along with huge donors. People don't fund nuance and complexity. No one wants to fund that. They want to fund like revolutionary movements on the right or the left. Much of what Barton does, I won't call him a historian. I mean, he is a political activist who uses the past to promote his political agenda, right? So he feels that because he can hold up a document, he convinces lay people, he convinces them, well, look, he's got the original document. Well, there's nothing that David Barton has in terms of the documents that you can't just go online and read yourself, right? You know, I mean, yeah, he spent like thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars to buy like this letter from John Adams. Here it is, right? And everyone's like, ooh, ah. I was like, I'll give you an URL right now where you can go read that exact same letter and interpret it. There's nothing about the fact that he owns the document that does anything to bolster his case. But evangelicals believe that it does, because it's like, wow. So when you actually read the documents, you find that Barton takes all kinds of things out of context. You know, sometimes literally, I write about this in the book. You know, today I was just reading something from Barton. I blogged about it so George, you know, we had these riots, which after the George Floyd killing, right, this summer. Right. And you know, I look on the Wall Builders website and it says the Boston Tea Party was not a riot. Well, immediately then you have to ask, why would David Barton right now suddenly take up an interest in the Boston Tea Party not being a riot? Well, he wants to show that the riots, the vandalism that happened in Minnesota, right? Mm-hmm. He wants to show that was un-American. And, you know, it broke with kind of, you know, American ideals to destroy things, right? Right. Well, if you look at the Stamp Act and the Tea Party, so-called Boston, all it was nonstop destruction of property, destroying government property in the name of patriotic liberty, right? I mean, by today's standards, they stole and destroyed millions of dollars of private property when they dumped that tea in the water. It was a riot, right? Now, again, I would condemn, as a Christian and as someone who, you know, has a moral view on this, I would condemn the riots today. I would the vandalism, at least, not the peaceful protests, but I would condemn violence in 1773 and in 2020. Right? They both deserve to be condemned, but don't use history. America was born in this kind of violence. Mm-hmm. What is tar and feathering? You grab a guy and you dump like steaming hot coal that gives you or tar that gives you second-degree burns all over your body, and you dump feathers over that person and you parade them through the streets. I mean, is that Christian? Do Christians do that kind of stuff? Right? You know, so let's not pretend that like the founding was this like innocent place that we have to get back to. It was a party, Barton says. The Boston Tea Party, that's why they called it a tea party. It was so peaceful and calm, you know. So that's just one example of the way they're trying to manipulate the past to try to make present day arguments.
We will end this episode of the Reintegrate podcast here. Our conversation continued with Dr. John Fia as we transitioned from how a nostalgic view of the founding of the country is a part of the reason why evangelicals embraced Donald Trump in the 2016 election. So come back next week for the next episode of Reintegrate to hear John Fia discuss his book titled after that line we hear so often from President Trump, Believe Me. The subtitle is The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump. Here's a taste.
So I think when Trump says make America great again, that could be interpreted by different parts of his coalition in different ways, right? So for some, just even some people, it doesn't have to be evangelicals who voted for Trump, I think that has an economic flavor to it, right? Like let's get back to where we are strong economically again. But I think for many evangelicals, it was this idea that we are going to make America Christian again. We're going to restore, renew, right, reclaim this nostalgic longing for a golden age. And depending on how you look at it, I've said this a lot, but depending on how you look at it, like you could make a case that they're longing or pining for a golden age that never actually really existed in the first place to any significant degree, right?
At least not for minorities and women,
yeah, exactly.
And all the Native Americans, all the things we've been talking about, right?
So what I always say, Bob, is, when people hear that phrase, make America great again, most people I talk to, like on the street or at church or, wherever, they tend to focus on the four words there, make America great again. They tend to focus on great. Like, what is America's greatness? What does it mean to be great, right? I'm a historian, and having done this now, you kind of get trained to think a certain way. So I sort of zero in on the word again, right? It's a historical claim, right? You're assuming that something happened in the past that was good that you want to get back to. So like what I always say is, look, you tell me when America was great, right? Nail it down for me. Right? When was it? Was it at the founding? Was it the 19th century? Was it the 1920s, the 1950s, the Reagan era? When was America great in your mind? And then let's sit down and have a conversation about what America was like in that era.
We'd love to hear your comments on this podcast. What do you think? Are you convinced that America was not specifically founded to be a Christian nation? Do Dr. Fia's arguments seem in any way plausible to you? Go to read-integrate.org and go to the podcast page to find ways to email us and even leave a message on a voicemail line. We'd love to hear from you. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you can hear fascinating guests talk about reintegrating our faith, life, and vocations.